Korea is going to go to this dispute and argue that those export restrictions from Japan are in violation of WTO rules. Does Korea have a case here?
Well, you know, both sides have grievances, and I think it's important to look at the broader context of this conflict. I think we are potentially at a turning point in the Japan-South Korea relationship. Japan has made the case that this is imposing restrictions on export of these chemicals because South Korea is not keeping up enough control. These are substances that can have dual use, and therefore Japan is saying that South Korea is not careful enough and that it can then take this action based on its export control measures. But as I was saying, there's a broader context here, and the fact is that Japan-South Korea relations have been deteriorating quite sharply in the past few months. The South Korean Supreme Court recently had a ruling that it sided with claimants for forced labor compensation, and therefore some assets were seized from Japanese companies. Japan has called for an arbitration as part of the 1965 Normalization Treaty, and South Korea has not been forthcoming. So Japan is going to say there's no WTO case here because it's part of our export control mechanism. South Korea is going to say this is retaliation for that broader dispute, and this is discrimination against us, and we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, it's an important point you make because you really can't separate the two. How difficult is it to remedy that underlying issue of Japan's behavior in colonial times in Korea?
You know, it's very difficult. We're talking about a fraught relationship. Japan and South Korea have never really put behind the shadow of history. But at the other level, there was a very substantive relationship, and the economic ties had really developed. And you can point to economic interdependence as something that held these two countries together. Now with the latest dispute, we're beginning to see the questioning of that premise. And I'm really worried about the fact that you have two countries that are market economies, that are democracies, that are allies of the United States, and all objectively, all elements would point to a shared endeavor to think about joint opportunities. And it seems that on the contrary, those two countries are wanting to have as much distance as they can from each other, that distrust is going to prevail. And in Japan, there is something that people talk about, Korea fatigue. Animosity is also growing now in South Korea with a boycott of Japanese goods. And therefore, we're looking at the possibility, Paul, of these two countries thinking that their futures are separate. And what that means for the United States policy in the region is also a pretty serious consideration.
Right. Let's talk about the U.S. because traditionally the United States has played a mediating role. Now, when President Trump was asked by, according to him, President Moon Jae-in of South Korea to help mediate, he responded, you know, how many things do I have to get involved in? He was not very happy about having to help. Can this dispute be solved without Washington?
I don't know. It's going to be very difficult. I think that in the past we have seen U.S. administrations take this animosity and the potential for distrust very seriously and intervene. And this actually was one element behind the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement between Japan and South Korea. The United States really put a lot of effort in order to make these two parties reach a compromise. But now, you know, the South Korean government very quickly did away with that Comfort Women Agreement. The United States does not have a lot of, has not become very involved in the dispute, has been slow moving. And therefore, this creates a real vacuum, and it's not clear whether just left to their own devices, Japan and South Korea will be able to find a compromise. And we don't see quick action from the U.S. administration in trying to get involved here.